Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
And welcome. I'm Carol Plumlee, a member of the board at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Reston. Whether you are Zoom or you're in the sanctuary, we are so glad you're with us this morning. No matter how old or how young you are, wherever you are in your spiritual journey, however you identify and whomever you love, know you are welcome here. Okay, we have a few special announcements this morning. A reminder, if you haven't made your auction payment yet, you can do that online. And if you have any questions about what you do owe for an auction payment, you can contact Kathy Delihanis or myself. But we are looking to wrap up the auction payments this month. There is an event next week. Then I can no longer live at home now. What? It's going to be the speaker, Helen Hips, who's a member of UUCR, and this program should be very informative. How do you determine the right level of care, evaluate facilities, obtain professional guidance during the aging process when needs change? I invite you to RSVP to Julia Norgard, and we're looking for a lot of people to attend that because it's a area of interest to a lot. Randy Newton from the Ministerial Search Committee, he's got an update for you.
Yeah, we just want to make sure the congregation stays fully informed. It's going very well. Our packet was very well received. We got a lot of applicants, but that means we're spending a lot of time reading through all of these packets and information and trying to make discernments. To use an imperfect dating analogy, we're sort of doing that swipe left or swipe right at the moment to see who wants to match with us in the end of it. And we're just very optimistic with the quality of the candidates we've been seeing, but it is a lot of work, and we appreciate the ability to serve you.
Thank you, Randy. Reverend Scott is going to share an announcement about the anti-racism event that's after this service today.
We are asking if people are interested to talk about our anti-racism and our inclusion work here in Reston area to come back following get a cup of coffee. We'll kind of yell at you outside. We'll ask that people leave the sanctuary at about 11:15 so that we can have a meeting where we're talking about what we've done and how we're going to proceed in the future. Kat is helping and Terry. And then on Saturday, February 4th, we're going to continue the conversation. You may not know that our denomination is changing its formative statements about what we're doing in the world. Part of that is about how we're dealing with racism and other interconnected issues, and that meeting is Saturday, February 4 from 10 to noon here. So we hope you'll be interested and attend all of both those meetings. Thank you. And today's session will go about 45, 50 minutes, maybe an hour.
Okay, now let us center ourselves for worship. Please take some deep, quieting breaths with me. Let us enter our time of worship together as we listen to this morning's prelude.
This morning with my mind, it was set was set on freedom. Well, I'm singing and dancing with my mind. Set on freedom. Well, I'm singing and dancing with my mind. Set on freedom. Well, hallelujah. 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 Oh, well, I walk, oh, well, I talk, oh, well, I walk, talk, and walk with my mind on freedom. Walk, talk, and walk with my mind on freedom. Talk. Well, I'm walking and talking with my mind. With my mind it was set on freedom. Well, I'm walking and talking with my mind. Set on freedom. Well, I'm walking and talking with my mind. It was set on freedom. Well, hallelujah. Hallelujah. Well, I'm preaching and praying with my mind. With my mind it was set on freedom. Well, I'm preaching and praying with my mind. Set on freedom. Well, I'm preaching and praying with my mind. It was set on freedom. Well, hallelujah. 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 Oh, well, I walk, oh, well, I talk, oh, well, I walk, talk, and walk with my mind on freedom. Walk, talk, and walk with my mind on freedom. Talk. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind. With my mind it was set on freedom. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind. Set on freedom. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind. It was set on freedom. Well, hallelujah. 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 Well, hallelujah. 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 Woo.
That choir. Kat and I are going to open now our Martin Luther King Sunday with these words from the man himself, who said, "We who must keep the church going and keep it alive have certain guidelines to follow: to preach good news to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, and to set at liberty them that are captives."
You see, the church is not a social club. The church is not an entertainment center. The church has a purpose. The church is dealing with ultimate concern.
Sunday after Sunday, week after week, people come to church with broken hearts. They need a word of hope. The church heals the brokenhearted.
Secondly, the role of the church is to free people. People who are slaves to prejudices, slaves to fear. The church is called to set free those that are captive, to set free those that are victims of slavery, the slavery of aggression and discrimination, and those caught up in the slavery of fear and prejudice.
These are our guidelines, and if we will only follow the guidelines, we will be doing what the church is called to do. We won't be a little social club. We won't be a little entertainment center.
But we will be about the serious business of bringing God's kingdom to this earth.
Our opening hymn.
opening hymn this morning is number 1018. Come and go with me to that land. Please rise in body or spirit and join us in singing.
Continuing on, as we light the morning chalice, we are reminded of this special day honoring the brilliance of Martin Luther King. Most of us remember and associate his life with his advocacy for nonviolence and his quest for justice. But Dr. King was a realist and used the weaknesses of the dark sides of many of our characters to make a point. Early in his career, Dr. King stood before an all-white audience, much like this, at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and said, "I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other." With regard to ignorance and stupidity, Dr. King noted, "Nothing in this world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." To love, Dr. King said, "Love is the greatest force in the universe. It is the heartbeat of moral cosmos. He who loves is a participant in the being of God." And for justice and injustice, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in the inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And the dream. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. May the light of this chalice burn in Dr. King's memory of his contributions during his lifetime.
Here at UUCR, we have a tradition of singing our covenant together every Sunday. Love is the spirit of this church. If you are at home on Zoom, we hope you will sing along. The words will be in your chat box. And here in the sanctuary, let's remain seated as we sing together.
Now is the time for all ages, so if anyone would like to come forward and sit on the floor or in the front row, make sure you can see the screen well. Please do so. We have plenty of room up front.
If we sit down, does that mean we have to get up?
Yes, yes. So there are chairs in the front row if you don't want to get up off the floor. Our story today is When We Were Alone. It was written by David A. Robertson, an award-winning author and member of the Norway House Cree Nation. And it was illustrated by Julie Flett, an award-winning Cree Métis author and artist. In this story, an American Indian girl, a Cree, talks with her grandmother. Today, I helped my kukum in her flower garden. She always wears colorful clothes. It's like she dresses in rainbows. When she bent down to prune some of the flowers, I couldn't even see her because she blended in with them. She was like a chameleon. Nukum, why do you wear so many colors? I asked. Nukum said, well, Nusism, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I wore many different colors. But at the school I went to far away from home, they gave us different colors to wear. All the children were dressed the same, and our clothes weren't colorful at all. We mixed together like storm clouds. Why did you have to dress like that? I asked. They didn't like that we wore colorful clothes, Newcomb said. They wanted us to look like everyone else. But sometimes in the fall, when we were all alone and the leaves had turned their autumn hues, we would roll around on the ground and we would pile the leaves on our clothes they had given us, and we would be colorful again, and this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always wear the most beautiful colors. After I'd helped with the flowers, we went over to the back gate. There were vines covering the gate, and they reached all the way to the ground. When my kukum turned to fix the latch, I saw that her braid hung almost as low as the vines. It was like she had a tail. Newcomb, why do you wear your hair so long? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nusism, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I grew our hair long, just like our people had always done. It made us feel strong and proud. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they cut off all our hair. Our strands of hair mixed together on the ground like blades of dead grass. Why did you have to wear your hair like that? I asked. They didn't like that we were proud, said Newcomb. They wanted us to be like everybody else. But sometimes in the spring when we were alone and the grass had grown so long and thick in the field, we would pick the blades from the ground. We would braid them in our short hair they had given us, and we would have long hair again. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always wear my hair very long. After my Cookum had fixed the latch, I followed her to the birdhouse. There was a bird flying through the air with a like a jingle dress dancer. She fed the bird and whispered to it in Cree. Newcomb, why do you speak in Cree? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nusissum, when I was your age at home in my community, my friends and I always spoke our language. But at the school I went to far away from home, they wouldn't let us speak our words. All the children used their strange words, and we didn't understand them at all. Our voices blended together like a flock of crows. Why did you have to speak their language? I asked. They didn't like that we spoke our language, Newcomb said. They wanted us to talk like everybody else. But sometimes in the summer, when we were alone and our teachers weren't anywhere around the place we were, we would whisper to each other in Cree. We would say all the words we weren't allowed to say so that we wouldn't forget them. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always speak my language. After our gardening work was done, I sat with my Cookum in the backyard. Her brother came over and sat with us. He comes over all the time. We drank tea and ate bannock. The tea was hot and sweet, and the bannock was moist and warm and melted in my mouth. My Cookum and my uncle talked and laughed like children. Newcomb, why do you and Nokomis spend so much time together? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nusissum, when we were your age at home in our community, being with family was the most important thing. We played with each other, did chores together, and shared everything. But at the school I went to far away from home, they wouldn't let us be together. My brother and I were separated like day and night. Why were you and Nokomis separated? I asked. They didn't like when we were with family, Newcomb said, because when we were together, we thought too much of our home. But sometimes in the winter, when we were alone and we were sure that nobody could see us, we would find each other. We would take off our mitts, and in the crisp, cold air, we would hold hands so we could be with each other. And this made us happy. Now, said Newcomb, as she reached over and held my uncle's hand and mine, I am always with my family. And so ends this story. Just before the sermon, children will be invited to leave for activities and to talk more about this story and how it relates to Martin Luther King Jr. Day. For now, please take your seats.
And a little later, I'm talking about skeletons in the American closet. One of our skeletons as Unitarians is that one of those Indian schools in North Dakota was run by us. Now is the time in our service when we share our joys and concerns so that no one ever has to hold them alone. If you're joining us remotely by Zoom this morning, you may wish to light a real or virtual candle wherever you are to mark what is on your mind and heart. As members of the present congregation here, come forward and take stones for each of their joys and concerns and sorrows and place them in the water which holds so much of our love. And they may take a stone from around the vessel to remind them during the week of what is on their heart. They can place that stone at their breakfast table or someplace at home that will remind them what's on their hearts this week. And if those of you at home would like to share something, please write it in the chat so that others can see it, but remember that that is then public. And those at home may read those chats and share in the virtual coffee hour amongst themselves. So let our ritual begin as our piano accompanist plays. let us be one in prayer and spirit. Spirit of life and love, which so faithfully animates this complicated creation of ours, we are grateful for this community that is with us in both times of joy and sorrow. And we hold in our hearts this morning all who are facing any hardship or difficulty, those in grief, facing illness or disability in themselves or those around them. In particular, this morning, we hold in our thoughts and prayers the people of California and Alabama who are suffering the vicissitudes of their weather, and the people of Ukraine, who, as you all know from the paper this morning, have had to endure another round of vicious and senseless attacks directed at civilians by the Russian military. Whether shared here this morning or held silently in our hearts, may our joys be multiplied in community, and may all gathered here this hour find comfort, safety, and calm. Amen.
As a self-funded church, UUCR relies on the generosity of its members and friends to fund daily operations and to ensure that the church and its resources are here for us and others now and in the future. Pledges support our worship and music programs, our religious education program, programs for members and friends, community outreach, and connections to Unitarian Universalism. We now invite you to support the work of UU Reston by making your donation to the collection plate if you are here in the sanctuary, or at the link on the slide and in the chat box. Thank you for your generosity and support of our beloved home.
So in just a moment, our children will leave. And Carol, stand up. We have free T-shirts, small, medium, and large. So kids, take a small T-shirt if you want. And adults, like Sterling, you can get a large one for your swim warm-ups. Take those shirts, please. We want to move them out of the building today on Martin Luther King Day when we stand on the side of love. Catherine will now play our recessional. I would like to begin this morning by asking for a measure of your indulgence, for I would like to begin my reflections on this MLK Sunday when we, by moral necessity, focus our attentions on the complicated issue of race in America by talking first about the history of my own particular American family, because I believe it's directly relevant to our broader discussion. Let me begin then at the beginning of my family's American story. My mother's Puritan ancestors, John and Sarah Reed, landed in Salem, Massachusetts almost 400 years ago, 1630, as a part of John Winthrop's great fleet, with 700 other desperate, impoverished settlers. And my father's Welsh ancestors similarly arrived from the British Isles many generations ago. So my American family has had almost 400 years, fully 12 generations, to achieve what we'd like to think all of us as the great promise and dream of America. And indeed, my family has greatly benefited from the abundant opportunity we have been given for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Both my parents were raised in the early 20th century with lives of extreme privilege, resulting from the fact that both of my grandfathers, Charles Alexander on my father's side and Mark Ewing on my mother's, were successful and wealthy industrialists, one in the manufacture of steel and the other in hydroelectric power. Here is my mother when she was a newly minted bride in Oklahoma in 1946. She grew up in wealth in Merrill, Wisconsin, and was educated at Northwestern University. And as an adult, she became a civil rights activist, a woman deeply concerned about and committed to racial equality and social justice in these United States. During her entire adult life, I'm very proud to tell you, she diligently worked right where she lived for greater racial understanding and justice and equality. This passionate commitment of hers is something of a surprise, I think, because, as I said, she grew up in a very sheltered environment, virtually all white northern Wisconsin, where her exposure to people of different races and cultures was extremely limited. Merrill, Wisconsin, the only diversity is between the different Lutheran churches. But somehow, by the time she reached adulthood, my mother had a passionate commitment to work in and with the African American community for greater educational, economic, and social equality. Upon graduating from Northwestern University with a degree in social work in the early days of World War II, my mother, who had plenty of opportunities to choose a comfortable and conventional life like her three brothers did, my uncles, instead went to work in 1941 at very low pay in a struggling neighborhood settlement house in the slums of Syracuse, New York, where she worked with the children of the poor, mostly African American, to help them become successful adults. For the duration of the war, she lived in that rough and tumble neighborhood where she worked with two roommates, an African American social worker who became a lifelong friend of my mother's, and this is another story unto itself, a Japanese American woman whom my mother had managed to liberate from one of the concentration camps. That's the only thing you can say, internment camp for the Japanese in California, again motivated by her deep commitment to social justice. The federal government allowed people to take Nisei into their lives as long as they would take responsibility for both their economic and other well-being. My mother remembered these years of working in the slums of Syracuse as some of the most purposeful and rewarding of her life. After the war, she married my naval officer father, who had fought in Europe, and moved to Tulsa, then to Racine, Wisconsin, to raise us 4 boys. And my mother's commitment to racial equality and justice, which began in Syracuse, continued in Racine. In the early 1960s, she pretty much single-handedly created a thriving community center in the one black neighborhood of Racine, Wisconsin, a predominantly poor community that by no one's imagination was, it was in the sunken industrial valley in the middle of Racine, Wisconsin. geographically, after pulling both black and white civic leaders together to launch the project, my mother not only provided the professional leadership and programming to get this off its feet, she also provided all the funds required to buy the center's first building, a bright pink house, after which the new center was named. It was the Pink House, and it served the institution for about 15 years. Years later, the growing community center moved to a new and much larger building and was renamed at my mother's insistence, the Bray Center, which is a big old abandoned church. And he was an African-American friend of my mother's and a Unitarian Universalist member of our local church. Today, more than 60 years later, still proudly located right in the center of that black community, the Bray Center is a thriving social service institution, providing a wealth of programming to support services for primarily African-American clientele, youth and adults, including a gymnasium, which is home to this nationally ranked basketball team and has been for many years. Anyway, what I want to share is that all throughout my formative years, I watched my mother work in Racine and beyond for racial empowerment, justice, and equality, and she instilled in me and my three brothers an understanding of the importance of this work in America. She always talked to us and modeled for us the importance of America facing and struggling to rectify its centuries of terrible racial oppression and inequality. And all this pride we took in my mother's racial justice work is perhaps why, following her death, my brothers and I were shocked, genuinely shocked, as we went through a bunch of old, dusty family photo albums that my mother had stuffed in a bureau somewhere, only to find a photograph almost identical to this one. A picture of two American men, probably from the 1920s, proudly armed with long rifles, dressed up in their KKK outfits. Although we were able to trace this photo back to the Illinois side of my Ewing Shars family, we have been unable to precisely determine who these two sinister men were and why their picture was in a family album. But you can guess. They were ancestors of mine, perhaps even a great uncle or great cousin. Who knows? What we do know is that they almost certainly were a part of my extended Ewing family, a shameful and embarrassing part of my ancestry as a Midwestern American of European descent. And though it pains for me to acknowledge it, these ugly folks, they are my people. Let me pause here and remind you of the ugly and complicated history of the KKK. The KKK is the name given to a number of past and present fraternal organizations in the United States that have variously advocated for white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, homophobia, and nativism. The first Klan was formed, many of you know, right after the Civil War in 1866 in the Deep South by veterans of the Confederate Army with the sole purpose of resisting Reconstruction and keeping the freed slaves in their subservient places at the bottom of the social, economic, and educational order. Now, this first Klan was virtually destroyed in the early 1870s by President Ulysses S. Grant's vigorous enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, also known as the KKK Act. But white supremacy, as you all know, has been so far proved impossible to kill. The second incarnation of the KKK, from which this photograph, family photograph, comes, was a massive whites-only organization which sprang up in the 20s with many local chapters and millions of members represented, believe it or not, about 15% of the American population, 15% of the entire population male joined the KKK. This organization, which in many parts of the country, including Midwestern states, like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, where hundreds of thousands of members were responsible for lynchings and firebombings, and of course throughout the South, and other violent activities directed against African Americans. Like its predecessor, this 20th century KKK was committed to maintaining the economic and social privileges and political power afforded to white Americans, while denying by force if necessary and intimidation and murder advancement and equality to African Americans. Now, mercifully, this organization, just as its predecessor, basically collapsed after decades of sinister activity and was virtually non-existent by the time the Second World War rolled around. But today, as you all painfully know, similar white supremacy organizations like the so-called Proud Boys, the National Association for the Advancement of White People, and the Aryan Brotherhood, and about 100 other sinister anti-black or neo-Nazi groups are enjoying a resurgence as an inevitable result of the rise of what is known as Trumpism and other white supremacy movements. This sad reality that American racism and dozens of supporting organizations thrive is why I took the risk this morning of sharing this painful little bit of my own family's dirty laundry. I shared this shocking and horrible photograph from my own family album, not because I particularly feel any direct or current personal guilt over it some 100 years ago. While I'm definitely chastened by my ancestors' beliefs and behaviors, I honestly do not feel any direct personal responsibility or any particular emotional connection to the terrible choices some of my ancestors may or may not have made a century ago in the context of their own fearful, ignorant, and prejudiced lives, any more than I would take personal credit today for my mother's work in Racine, Wisconsin, which made such a difference. I share this undeniable part of my own family story, and here it is in black and white. I can't avoid it, because it serves me and all white Americans of European descent who are facing the tragic facts of America's violent and oppressive racial history. And the 1619 Project is right, despite conservatives' complaints about it. Race is one of the central organizing principles of American life. This is a stark reminder of the power and privilege and prejudice that history has given me and all white Americans such an incredible advantage over those Americans whom we enslaved and otherwise held down or impressed. Just one more painful example from my own personal family history, this legacy of racial power and prerogative and privilege, if I might. My mother was born Marcia Ewing, and I directly descend from a long line of very proud Ewings and McEwens who traced their roots all the way back to ancient Scotland. This is Patrick Ewing. Now, how do you think he got his name? He got his name because his great-grandfather and great-grandmother were enslaved by some of my Ewing relatives. Every time I see this great athlete and wonderful man, the undeniable historical truth that Patrick Ewing and I share our name for only one sad reason. And one more little difficulty from my own personal history. One last skeleton. Next picture, please. I am related by my father's family to General George B. McClellan, my grandmother, Mary McClellan's uncle. He was a railroad executive, Civil War general of dubious distinction. You Civil War buffs know. He was the Democratic presidential candidate against Lincoln in 1864, and finally, unbelievably, he became the governor of New Jersey. Did you know that? As the war began, one historian writes, McClellan, quote, was more interested in winning the war than he was in ending slavery. In that, like many on the northern side at the time, he publicly opposed the outright abolition of slavery. Needless to say, I am, in addition to everything else I've shared with you about my particular American heritage, I'm not terribly proud of my great uncle, General George B. McClellan. And I'm glad, frankly, he lost badly to Lincoln in 1864. So, to tie all these personal stories together, while I profoundly wish it were otherwise, as a privileged white American male living in these supposedly enlightened and improved early years of the 21st century, I personally have some very ugly skeletons in my American closet. Both the immorality of slaveholding and tacitly allowing slavery in the case of McClellan, and the murderous lawlessness of the KKK are directly in my extended family's past. I am sure that the same is true for many of you if you come from European ancestors sitting right here in the room, and perhaps I'll hear some of those stories of your connection to this stuff. I know it's not just me. Now, let me pause right here and be very clear about something. I bring all this up and I share my own direct ancestral links to American racism this morning, not because I want to lay some big white liberal guilt trip on every light-skinned person in this room, myself included. I'm not interested in guilt trips. Virginia Governor Youngkin and a host of other so-called conservative Americans accuse progressives like me of browbeating and embarrassing white Americans for the racial sins of their ancestors. But I have no interest in doing that. I do have an interest, unlike Governor Youngkin, in telling the truth about American history and Virginia history. That's what he doesn't want to do. He doesn't want to tell the truth. I bring up our collective racial past on this MLK Sunday in the year 2023, not to make anyone feel bad, but to remind us all of the truth, that as a nation, America is not even close to being finished with the pressing moral and societal work of remediating the damage done to black and white Americans alike by many generations, first of slavery and following that, generations of systematic, economic, educational, and social oppression and inequality. In this year, 2023, all Americans, as citizens of our troubled and churning nation, have a pressing moral duty to face our shameful racial past, and this is the hard part. Promise to commit the resources, economic, governmental, and personal, that will continue to be required to truly heal our nation and begin to, as best we can, make things right. Now let me stop right here and take a moment to remind you of a bit more of our shared history. This somewhat more recent and immediate relevant than my own family past, and then suggest to you where I think we must move as a nation in regards to our grievously ongoing national struggle with the issues of race, discrimination, equality, and privilege. Following the watershed 1954 Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education, which, as you all know, began the painful and slow process of desegregating America's racially divided schools with the goal of providing equal education and opportunity for all. Following Brown v. Board of Ed, for several decades, federal, state, and local governments began to implement a wide range of costly, remedial, tax-supported social programs designed to correct the accumulated economic, educational, and social harm done to African Americans and other discriminated against racial minorities, including Native peoples, that Linda mentioned this morning. The most systematic and noteworthy of these remedial programs on the federal level began with President Kennedy's New Frontier proposals, which were expanded after President Lyndon Baines Johnson managed three things. He persuaded a reluctant Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of '64. He announced a wide-ranging remedial war on poverty program, and he pushed through Congress a wide range of other support programs, which he said would lead to, quote, a great society. You may not remember this, but in the year 1965 alone, there were some 115 presidential legislative recommendations, 90 of which were quickly enacted by a supportive and somewhat bilateral Congress, launching wide-range programs designed to help the poor and racial minorities, most especially African Americans, who again were disproportionately, for obvious historical and racial reasons, suffered the greatest economic hardship. And indulge me a quick, but I think telling aside here about just one of these remedial programs. Back in the 1990s, back in the 2000s, first 10 years of 2000s, I served the River Road congregation over in Bethesda. And one of our distinguished older members there was a gentleman named Brad Patterson. He died about 2 years ago. There's Brad. He happened to be a staunch Rockefeller Republican, and he was a rare breed in that liberal congregation. He was a member of the White House staff who started to work for President Nixon and stayed on through Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And he told me, after I preached an MLK Sunday sermon once, he told me when we were discussing the persistent issues of race and poverty, a story about a White House meeting in the mid-'60s with his boss, Sergeant Shriver, who was in charge of the overall anti-poverty effort. In looking over the proposal to spend millions in poor, predominantly African-American, inner-city and rural schools, Shriver noticed a budget items for hundreds of thousands of dollars of plain wall mirrors and skeptically asked the project manager what possible use could schools have for $850,000 of mirrors. The project manager matter-of-factly replied, "The mirrors are for the classrooms because so many of these children have never seen themselves in a mirror and have not had the opportunity to develop appropriate self-awareness and self-esteem." And that silenced the entire room, including the president. Just let that fact sink in. Mirrors needed so black people could see themselves for the first time. But back to my broader history. In the 60s and 70s, President Johnson's Great Society initiatives and other remedial social programs designed to lift discriminated against minority populations out of poverty, they enjoyed, I believe, widespread support of the American people, including, of course, as I remember, my parents, who were totally committed to America moving out of its past. But as the nation has moved into the last 2 decades of the 20th century and into the first 2 decades of this century, many in America have become impatient, even hostile, to both the cost and the possible ineffectiveness of such programs. Economic and social conservatives in particular began to raise their voices and their political clout against these tax-supported remedial programs and suggested that the great economic, educational, and social gaps between various racial and ethnic groups in America could best be closed not by, quote, throwing more federal dollars at the program, but rather, the conservatives said, by insisting that those who find themselves poor take more, quote, individual responsibility for their own educational and economic advancement. The saying goes that they were to, quote, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Under the weight of this conservative argument and a growing resentment in many American quarters against paying taxes for any purpose, over recent decades, most especially over recent years, we have seen a steady and intentional reluctance to fund federally mandated and financed remedial programs designed to compensate and correct for past racial oppression. And there's also been a simultaneous and widespread rollback, in the part due to recent decisions of an increasingly conservative Supreme Court, are what are known as affirmative action programs, both in educational and business spheres. What is clear is that in the year 2023, is that for some time now, America has been moving away from its commitment to a concerted government investment aimed at correcting long-standing poverty and racial discrimination, a trend which I and many others regard as a grave societal and moral mistake. For as I have said, I believe we are nowhere close as a nation to having together significantly addressed the collective damage done by our systematic racist past. But let me pause and suggest right here, as is so often the case when we are looking at vexing and persistent social problems, I suspect that this national situation of ours right now concerning race and remediation of historic discrimination may be more complex than any of us, even us progressives, want to admit. As I thought in preparing this sermon about the dualism, there is a deep divide between the liberal progressive commitment to costly programs of social remediation on the one hand, and the conservative insistence on encouraging more individual responsibility on the other. It occurs to me, and please let's have an open and sincere conversation about this at a later time. It occurs to me that when it comes to the dream of America achieving greater racial justice and social equality, these two first seemingly incompatible perspectives may each be, at least to some degree, simultaneously true. First, as I've already said, because African Americans in particular historically suffered generations of spirit-crushing slavery and subsequent oppression, additional and substantial government remediation and corporate investment by all of us obviously will be required to bring about true equality in these United States. And at the same time, and please hear me here, the same is true whether we are talking about white poverty in the rurals of Appalachia, or Latino poverty in the barrios of South Los Angeles, or black poverty on the south side of Chicago. Whenever you encounter poverty, no amount, I think, of government remediation and investment will work unless those individuals of any racial, cultural, or ethnic background, now trapped in a cycle of poverty and joblessness and illiteracy and deprivation, are able to step up and take some individual responsibility for the future of their own lives and the lives of their children. Although it is not without controversy, this is precisely the largely conservative message that African American economist Thomas Sewell and even social icon Oprah Winfrey and former cabinet officer Ben Carson and other outspoken black leaders are all currently preaching to black audiences. Although, as a dyed-in-the-wool progressive myself, I am always inclined to unflinchingly support costly government anti-poverty programs, it also makes some sense to me that in many situations, no amount of governmental remediation and investment will work unless those families suffering from generations of poverty and discrimination are willing and able and empowered to play an active role in working to improve their own situations. Indeed, one of the greatest and sometime overlooked success stories of American society over the last century is the inspiring and in many ways spectacular fact that millions upon millions upon millions of African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in chains as recently as only 150 years ago, with the help, don't forget, of tax-supported government remediation and support programs and affirmative action, millions have also diligently applied themselves in situations where they were repeatedly obliged to surmount prejudice and racism and discrimination by working harder and longer and smarter than other Americans had to, like me. The bottom line here is that I believe both liberals and conservatives have something to contribute here. As America struggles now in these early decades of the 21st century to move the whole nation toward greater equality and justice. Liberals and progressives, both black and white, are morally and politically right to call for more and better designed social remediation programs that invest significant government resources, your tax dollars, in correcting past discrimination and oppression of all minority populations. And conservatives, both black and white, are also correct, at least on some level, to encourage the impoverished of whatever race or background to invest whatever they can of themselves in their own personal situations. I want to just give one example of this merger of liberal and conservative perspectives. 15 years ago, when I lived in Washington, D.C., as I do now, the then young African-American mayor, Adrian Fenty, who, by the way, got that Scottish name the same way Patrick Ewing got his name. He was enslaved by Fentys, but that's another story. He announced, and this is pure progressive remediation, he introduced a comprehensive citywide adult illiteracy elimination program, which was designed as a partnership between government, which provided the literacy centers and teachers, and the impoverished parents and families who were asked to take the initiative to get themselves and their children to the centers to work on learning how to read. As a taxpayer of the district, I was fully aware that 1/3 of the population of DC at that time was illiterate, was functionally illiterate. 1/3 of the entire 850,000 people were illiterate, so this program was desperately needed. And I was thrilled myself with my tax dollars from DC going to this partnership program. And it had, I think, a large impact that was positive. We all have an urgent responsibility to support such programs designed to mitigate the legacy of American racism. I want to introduce you to the Reverend Dr. Crystal Bourgeol. She was one of the affiliate ministers in my Vero Beach congregation from which I came to be with you. And she's an astounding community leader. She single-handedly developed this thing called the Gifford Youth Orchestra, which has seen hundreds of kids, mostly from poor black Gifford, into colleges and into music programs. Some of them are on Broadway, and just tremendous success. Repeatedly, when Crystal would preach at I'm getting my congregations mixed up, Vero Beach, she would say, "I want you all to use your white privilege." What are you afraid of your white privilege for? Use your white privilege. Use it for the good. Use it to motivate our society to do what it has to do. Become active allies, all you white faces out there in Vero Beach, in this struggle for my community. Use your white privilege. So I end this Martin Luther King Sunday by affirming what I believe is our primary responsibility, and that is our primary responsibility in this great struggle that will define whether this country lives up to its noble aspirations at all, is as citizens, voters, and taxpayers do everything we can to ensure that our government on the federal, state, county, and local level invests wisely and responsibly in affirmative action and remedial programs, restitution, while never failing to encourage those to whom the funds are directed to step up and do their parts as well. It frankly saddens me that at this particular juncture in American history, many comfortable and successful Americans want to forget or deny this truth about the necessity of racial and economic justice work that remains for America to accomplish. But perhaps if we constantly remind ourselves about those persistent skeletons in our closet, that remain in our closet, skeletons of our violent and oppressive racist past, which we have not succeeded in moving past, perhaps we will find the national will to once again somehow make all this right. In particular, I pray that you, as committed Unitarian Universalists, will be a steady and reliable voice in our families, in our workplaces, in our social and friendship circles, neighborhoods, and communities, advocating for America to do the hard and, yes, expensive work of undoing the damage that our ancestors did in the past. It is clear to me that in the year 2023, the dream of racial equality and social justice, genuine, that Martin Luther King had for America, will take more time and more effort and more money than any of us would have hoped. But this is the dream we must not defer. This is the dream we must never abandon. This is the dream we must keep at the forefront of our American agenda. The dream of an America with genuine opportunity and genuine equality for all. There is, to be sure, a long and hard and costly road ahead for all of us, but use your white privilege. Use your white privilege. We have no moral choice but to stay the course and steadily strive, no matter how long it takes, to make things right. Amen. We will build a land. By God, we will.
Closing hymn is number 121, We'll Build a Land. Please rise and body your spirit. We will sing 3 verses, 1, 2, and 4.
Where the oil
Please be seated. And finally, we send you on your way with these words again from Martin Luther King, Jr. We are in a beautiful struggle for a new world. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world.
Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell our sisters and brothers the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their arrival as full persons? And we send our deepest regrets?
Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost?
The choice is ours. And though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Amen. Let's get busy. Come back in 15 minutes to find out how. Amen. All yours.
Okay. We now extinguish this flame. But not the light of hope and truth, the warmth of community, nor the fire of commitment. These we will carry forth in our hearts until we are together again.
Our postlude today is for all of us to sing together, hymn number 1014. The title of this hymn has been changed by the composer to Answering the Call of Love. So please rise, embody your spirit, and join us.
Thank you for that. That was a wonderful service. We invite our congregants attending worship on Zoom to join us for our virtual Greet Your Neighbor Coffee Hour today to discuss the service theme and enjoy fellowship with other congregants. The link is in the chat box and will be a forthcoming slide. We hope you will also use the chat box as a virtual receiving line to leave a message about your appreciation for the worship service. Those here in person, we hope you'll join us for the anti-race and congregational conversation. We'll begin in just a few minutes. Please grab your coffee or tea, meet us back in the sanctuary. If you wanted one of these lovely t-shirts, take a t-shirt from the East Foyer. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.